For now, we're about ready to begin with exploiting unpatched iOS vulnerabilities for fun and profit. And I hope you enjoy the talk. And one last thing I needed to mention, when you do have questions, if you have questions, it'd be great if you could use the microphone so that it gets onto the video as well. Thank you.
Thanks, David, for the introduction. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Billy Lau. And today we are going to, my colleagues, Yongjing Zhang, sitting right here, and Tianlei Wang, and Byung-Yong Lee, who is unable to be with us today. We are going to present basically our work entitled Exploiting Unpatched iOS Vulnerabilities for Fun and Profit. And basically this is one of the research works that we are doing at the Georgia Tech Information Security Center, also known as GTISC. So before we go too far deep into the details, let me bound this talk. Basically, today you will be listening to how we basically execute unsigned code as root outside of the sandbox in iOS 7.1 to 7.1.2. And let me be clear, we will not be covering iOS kernel vulnerabilities. Although this may seem as a limitation, this actually distinguishes our work. Now, without further ado, let's look at how the talk is going to be laid out. First, I am going to talk about iOS security. Basically, we are going to answer the question of why is rooting an iOS device hard. And then we are going to look at how previous jailbreaks were performed. We're going to look at we're going to derive general steps and learn the general criteria that needs to be fulfilled in order for something to be called jailbreak. And then we are going to analyze in detail the Evasion 7 jailbreak. From there, we will then further look at how Apple patched the Evasion 7 jailbreak by looking at the patch logs in iOS 7.1. And then from there, we can basically figure out which vulnerabilities have been patched. With that, this means we can also deduce which vulnerabilities are unpatched. Then, with that, we can proceed by basically knowing that which steps needs to be reproduced or re-exploited in order for the entire jailbreak attack to happen. In this process, my colleagues will be also presenting basically our discovery for new vulnerabilities which replace the patch ones in Evasion 7. Then finally, we are going to present detailed information about how we achieve jailbreak in iOS 7.1.2. Now let's begin. iOS security basically rests its strength in these four main security features, such as secure boot chain, mandatory code signing, app sandbox, privilege isolation. I will go through each one of this in quite some detail. First, let's look at the secure boot chain. Basically, the firmware of each device is encrypted, and it is encrypted with the GID key of the device. And this means that the firmware image can only be decrypted on the device, and the key to this is designed to be not easily leaked. On top of that, there is a chain code signing check during the boot process, which makes it very hard, almost impossible to inject, run arbitrary unsigned code. This leads into the second security feature, which is mandatory code signing. This comes as a mandatory policy on iOS platform. Basically, what this means is that code must have correct signature in order for it to be installed and run. And the enforcement is basically done by the kernel through something called the Apple Mobile File Integrity, or the MFI. And this is a kernel extension. And then the code signing check is handled by another user space daemon called AMFID. This basically constitutes the mandatory code signing. On top of that, there is also this read, write, execute protection. Basically, what this means is just that any process is not allowed to have the write and execute permission concurrently on any single memory page. for obvious reasons, except for dynamic code sign entitlement holders. Apps that have this entitlement are, example of such apps is mobile Safari. Now, on top of all that, during runtime, apps are basically running in sandbox. So all third-party apps downloaded, basically this refers to apps that are downloaded from the App Store or even custom signed apps, either through the developers or enterprise license, resides at the /var/mobile. These apps will be contained by a built-in sandbox. It's with a specific name called container, and the enforcement is done by the kernel. And then there are some other built-in binaries where the sandbox is initiated in a slightly different way, which is through the invocation of API in the libsandbox.dylib. Example of such binary is the AFCD. Now, if you attempt to execute a third-party app outside of the container, this will trigger an exception called the outside of container and not ICANN-has debugger. And basically, without the ability to patch the kernel, basically it is very hard or impossible to break out of the sandbox for these normal apps. And if you would like more details about the Apple's App Sandbox, please refer to the Apple Sandbox talk in the Black Hat DC 2011. Now, moving on, let's look at another security feature called the privilege isolation. Basically, for the class of normal apps that I mentioned just now that are installed on iOS devices, will be given the UID of 501, which means that they run as mobile users. And these are basically isolated from other type of binaries apps that runs as root daemons. Examples of this is syslogd or the lockdown-d. Now, with this in mind, we are now able to basically have a better understanding of why is rooting an iOS device hard. Now, Sandbox, of course, here we see that it is mandatory for all apps, user apps downloaded from App Store to be running in Sandbox, and then user cannot simply run code that is unsigned. So in order to root, you must bypass this code signing check. On top of that, you also need privilege escalation. As mentioned, these apps run as mobile UID, so you need to escalate to the root processes. Now, also, another point to take note here is that the routing is hard because it is usually you cannot make permanent modification to the kernel image, and because the integrity check is strictly enforced during the boot time. So now let's look at the general methods that is agreeable for jailbreaking. So for what I'm about to discuss are all the criteria basically that people have agreed on that constitutes jailbreaking. So let's look at the first one is basically you need to bypass code signing. There are many ways to do that. Here we point you to two examples. Number one is you can exploit vulnerabilities in the DYLD during loading of the code. You can see examples of this in Evasion 7 and the Pangu jailbreak. Or you can use ROP or exploit the process with dynamic code signing. So you can think about it like exploiting mobile Safari. Second criteria, also mentioned earlier, you need to escape the sandbox. Again, many ways to do that. One of it includes, of course, exploiting unsandbox process. Or you can exploit design flaw in sandbox implementation itself. Now, this also includes overriding sandbox functions in the libsandbox.dylib. What this means is that you can, by using this technique, you can basically run the sandbox process without actually invoking the real sandbox. It's like, you think about it like executing a dummy process, dummy function. Now, for apps in a container, this means that the normal apps that you download from the App Store, in order for you to escape from the sandbox, basically you will need kernel patching. So on top of all that, even escaping from sandbox, you will need root privilege escalation. One of the ways to do that is through exploiting the vulnerabilities that can be found in the existing root daemon on the system. Example of such daemon is the crash housekeeping. And then if you have all these capabilities, on top of that, you need the capability to basically patch the kernel. But if you have this capability, it actually gives you stronger functionalities, such as you can directly disable code signing. You can then directly disable kernel enforced sandbox. And then you can re-enable the read, write, execute mapping for the memory pages. And on top of that, you can enable kernel debugging for various purposes. Now, having that said, with all these capabilities that you have, sometimes you desire the jailbreak to persist. This means that you need to be able to apply these permanent changes. So examples of ways to achieve this is basically one is to override the root partition. This can be done by basically remounting the root partition as a with read-write permission. This can be seen for like iOS versions less than 7, or you can use the AFCD itself for like iOS version 7.0. However, even if you do that, you are not able to modify critical parts that are involved during the boot sequence, because if you try to do that, as mentioned earlier, the integrity check, which comes as a security feature, will basically cause your boot process to be blocked. So without further ado, now I'll pass the time to Yongjin to explain how Evasion 7 achieves jailbreak.
Thank you for a really nice introduction on the security features on the iOS that makes the jailbreaking harder than the other operating system. So now I will cover how Evasion 7 works, the only jailbreak tool available when this research is done, the only tool for the iOS 7. Yeah. So this is important because we reconstruct our attack starting from the unpatched vulnerabilities of the Evasion 7 attack in iOS 7.1 and higher version. As we talked about each steps of the general ways of the getting jailbreak, Evasion 7 go through each step of the bypassing call sign check and escaping of the sandbox and overwriting the root partition. So before getting into the detail, we thanks to evaders for releasing their jailbreak tool to let us studying about their exploit, and we really thanks to GeoHot for his detailed write-up. So this is an exploit workflow graph of the Evasion 7 attack. We had identified 9 vulnerabilities are chained together to achieve jailbreak in Evasion 7. So we will cover each by each. Let's start with the first step. The first one is installing app with encrypted info.plist. Info.plist is a file that contains the metadata of the application. So in particular, a malformed value in the field called CF bundle executable, this allows the installing the app outside of the container directory. So look at the figure at the bottom. So Evasion 7 uses the multiple of the // to traverse up the directory for the executable. So that path is not only used for performing cosign check, and later also it is used for running the executable. So on clicking the app button, the file at that location will be executed instead of the executing the binary inside of the app container. So just pushing the original executable at that folder called media and downloads, that makes that installation to be succeed. And this first step will be linked with the second step. And the second step is executing AFCD. a non-container binary on clicking the app icon installed in the step number 1. So as we can see from the name, AFCD is a daemon for handling the AFC protocol, and AFC stands for Apple File Conduit, which handles the transferring media and photos and other files in and out from the device through the USB cable. And there is a default AFCD daemon. It's running on the device upon the USB connection, and it can only access the files under the VAL mobile media directory. So that's why evaders set the directory at the first step under the VAR mobile media downloads. On a PC side, they can change the contents of the executable file as a hashbang, like the line in the middle. So by setting hashbang with like that, like a AFCD with some arguments, on clicking the application installed in the step number 1, that will invoke another instance of the AFCD, and the argument shows that the -s as a somewhat allows access to the special files, and -d with root allows to AFCD to access the root, and having a new port to avoid that duplicating on the binding address. So clicking the app icon will trigger the execution of the AFCD instead of the installed application. For the third step is to make the default AFCD to access /temp directory. As I mentioned earlier, the default AFCD has a sandbox policy that can only access the files under the VAR mobile media. But there exists a symlink bug in the sandbox policy. So evasion team exploited this bug, and they let the AFCD to create a symlink with the multiple number of the // and /temp, and at the inside of the multi-level nested directory under the sandbox directory. So as you can see, at the creation time of the symlink, the target of the symlink is still inside of the sandbox of the AFCD, but if later the evaders move up that file to the upper directory, then it will eventually point to the /temp. So at that point, iOS fails to make the security check, so AFCD can access to the /temp directory. And that part is linked with the fourth step. The fourth step is injecting environmental variables with install D. Evasion 7 utilized a bug in the install D that is caused by a race condition on extracting zip archive on the directory. So on installation, install D will create a temporary directory at /temp named like install staging and with some random numbers, and foo extracted, then unzip their IPA archive into that directory. However, there exists a race condition. Right after the creation of that directory, if the previously sandbox escaped AFCD can delete it and create a symlink with the same name and point it to the other directory, then the install D will extract the zip archive in the wrong place. So, for example, the evaders set a target of the symlink as a var mobile library caches, then the install D will unzip the file into that directory. In particular, Evasion 7 overrides a file called com apple mobile installation plist, which handles the execution of the app. At this step, they injected an environmental variable called dyld insert libraries, which inject the dynamic library in with a very high priority. So then on the application's execution, the library injected at first, so they can override some functions. Yeah. So figure at the bottom shows that how to inject the environmental variables. But note that this figure is not from the Evasion 7. So during the reconstructing our attack, we prepared that one. Yeah. But it shows that how one can inject the environmental variables. And next step is bypassing cosign. To bypass cosign check, Evasion 7 directly exploited a bug in the dynamic loader called DYLD. So on cosigning check, DYLD looks for the size of the code section. So you can see on the right figure on the right side, there is a code section and size 0. Then cosigning check will not be applied. So Evasion 7 forged a dynamic library called gameover.dialib with the 0-size code section. This trick completely bypasses cosign check. Although there will be the no cosigning code section because size 0, but some of the header of the macO file will be mapped into the same executable memory region. So having a function export table, such as the figure at the bottom, then the dialib can override some functions. So Evasion 7 has overridden the very critical functions on the sandbox invocation. So the dynamic library could nullify the sandbox. And the sixth step is combining number 2 and number 4 and number 5. By combining them, now the Evasion 7 can inject dynamic library into a non-container process to escape the sandbox. So the previously installed application at stage 1, on clicking the app icon, will trigger to execution of another instance of the AFCD, and it will load gameover.dialib at the first. Since gameover.dialib nullified all the sandbox-related functions, so AFCD fails to initialize the sandbox, and it now runs as a out of sandbox, but with the mobile permission. So for the next step, Evasion exploits a root daemon to get a write access to the root partition. And there is a daemon called crash housekeeping that runs as root, has a symlink vulnerability. So you can see from the screenshot, there are invocation of change own and change mode. And this step is downgrading directories, UID, and permission to make it accessible to the regular mobile user. Because that crash housekeeping daemon runs as a root, if we just create a directory, then it is root permission. So they need to downgrade the permission. However, on this step, they fails to check whether the target is a symlink or not. So Evasion 7 used AFCD to create a symlink that points to the dev rdisk S1 S1, which points to the block device of the root partition and created to the Apple support location. So with this symlink, after the reboot, crash housekeeping will change the permission of the root block device instead of that directory. So after the reboot, it will be readable and writable by the mobile user. And for the next step, Evasion 7 overrides the root partition to make the permanent change on the system. In step number 2, we specified -s option in AFCD. And I mentioned that it is for accessing special files, and that special file refers to block device files. So just directly opening the dev rdisk S0, S1, S1, it allows to open the whole partition of the root directory, and AFCD, the newly launched AFCD, can make the permanent change on the root partition. And at the last, Evasion 7 exploited a kernel vulnerability to patch the kernel. So basically, this nullifies security checks at the kernel level, make the device to be jailbroken. So these 9 steps are detailed steps of Evasion 7 attack. However, in iOS 7.1, it is known that the Apple's patch has fixed all the Apple's patch blocked the Evasion 7 attack. And let's see how the Apple fixed the bug. From the security patch information released from the Apple, we can easily identify which is the patch for the Evasion 7 by looking at the contributor line. So it is mentioned that as evaders at the bottom. So for the vulnerability in the code signing check, Apple has patched dynamic loader to not to allow the not to bypass the zero-sized code section. And next, Apple fixed the symlink trick that makes AFCD to access the /temp. And for crash reporting, Apple has fixed the vulnerability by changing the change mode and change on to the L change on and L change mode to not to follow up the symlink. And also, kernel vulnerability has been fixed. And in addition, as a miscellaneous one, we found that the AFCD no longer has a -S option that allows the accessing of the block device file for overriding root partition. So from the patch, we can draw this graph that shows how Evasion 7 attack has been patched in iOS 7.1 and until for the iOS 7.1.2. They have fixed the vulnerability number 3, 5, 7, 8, 9. Although they has not fixed all of the vulnerabilities, the full chain, since the full chain of the vulnerability is required to achieve jailbreak, it seems Apple has effectively fixed the Evasion 7 attack by cutting the critical parts. However, we claim that this is not true. For the next, TLA will present how we can reconstruct the attack from the unpatched vulnerabilities.
So I will continue to introduce how we use iOS 7.1.2. So at the beginning of the work, we just want to figure out how Evasion 7 worked. And soon we realized that actually Apple didn't fix all the vulnerabilities. That's pretty interesting. And we asked ourselves, by only exploiting the unpatched vulnerabilities, what we can do. And then we realized maybe even for the patched vulnerabilities, we may find some new ways to re-exploit them. And we may be able to find or discover new vulnerabilities that are similar to the patched ones. And we can replace the patched ones with a new discovery. And then we can reconstruct the whole exploit chain. So with this goal in mind, we reviewed the patched vulnerabilities again. And for the vulnerability number 3 and number 5, we easily find a solution. Basically, our idea is to leverage the developer license. Developer license can offer 2 advantages. First of all, I think all the apps created from developer license by default have the access to /temp folder. And that means we don't have to rely on AFCD to create a symbolic link under /temp. And by using some malicious app, we can still win the risk condition in install-D and force install-D to override some critical files. And the other advantage is not only the developer license can also be used to sign some dynamic library so that we can inject the dynamic library to some uncontainered proxy apps and re-implement exploit 6. And let's stop here for a short while and think about what we can do by only exploiting vulnerability number 3 and number 4. And we realize there's a very realistic attack scenario. For example, if you download an app from App Store, which asks you to install another app by abusing the distribution over air feature, during the installation process of the other app, this malicious app can create some symbolic link under /temp, and the install-D will be tricked to override some system configurations. For example, in iOS, there's a feature called restriction. Based on this feature, the user can specify what kind of functionalities can run on the device. For example, there's a feature called installing app. If you disable that, that means in future you cannot install other apps. And if you disable the removing app functionality. That means you cannot remove any apps on your device. And we found that actually we located the configuration file for this feature, and we asked install-D to overwrite this configuration file. By doing that, you can see on there are two snapshots. The left one shows before we launch an attack, all the functionalities are disabled. But after the attack, we can still re-enable all the attacks. More importantly, to enable the restriction setting, the user needs to set up a passcode. Unfortunately, the passcode is also stored in that configuration file. That means the install-D can overwrite the configuration file and reset your passcode. If you don't know the passcode, you cannot use the restriction functionality anymore. We think it's a very severe denial of service attack. And after we after we find a way to re-enable number 3 and number 5, we can inject our dynamic library into a non-sandboxed proxy, but But this process still runs at mobile. We need a way to get the access to the root partition. And because the symbolic link vulnerability in crash housekeeping has been fixed, our idea is, can we find some similar vulnerabilities? What we did is very simple. We just run 2 commands. First, we just grab change on and change mode under the system on iOS 7.0.6. And we did find a number of programs use 2 APIs. To simplify the task, we also list all the daemons running as root, and we only analyze these programs. And we are very lucky. For the first program we analyzed, it's called syslog-D. We find a similar vulnerability in 5 minutes. I will show you some details of the bug. In the code, you will see the syslog-D will invoke change on and change mode to drop the permissions of this folder. And what we did is just like as the tricks used in Evasion 7. We create a symbolic link from this folder to the root partition. And then we gain the access to the root partition. And we have to handle another challenge, because to access the root partition, Evasion 7 used the AFCD program, which has the -S option, which can handle the special file. Because -S option has been removed from in iOS 7.1, what we did is we just dump the whole partition into your computer. And on your computer side, you can remount the disk and make any change you want. And later you can dump it back to the iPhone. Finally, we want to get root privilege on the device. Unfortunately, we don't have very good kernel vulnerabilities. What we did is we tried to ask the system to allow us for root privilege. The first target is the plist configuration files for launch-D. However, since iOS 6, all these configuration files are embedded in a cache file. This file is signed by Apple. We are not able to modify this file. However, we find another program called lockdown-D, which runs at root, and it can also launch other new services or apps with the root privilege. And the good news is the configuration file called service.plist is not protected. So we can easily modify this file and ask lockdown-D to run our targeted apps as root. And I will quickly go through what we did different from Evasion 7. First, the way that we get access to /temp is through a developer-signed app. And this app will create symbolic links under /temp and force install-D to overwrite a critical file. And later, we inject a library signed by our developer license into a unsandboxed process. And to simplify the task, we implement a constructor in the library, which will be executed upon the library is loading into the memory. And because this code will be executed before the sandbox is initialized, and we can run the code after the sandbox. And as I mentioned earlier, we can directly dump the root partition, use the syslogd exploit, and modify it at the PC side and write it back to the device later. A very important feature we want to do is to disable the code signing check. The traditional way is to, if you can override two very important APIs, then you can disable the code signing check. So the trick used by Evasion 7 is this: if there is a special file called enable.libs to override cache exists under this folder, the dynamic loader will separately load all the libraries from the library folder. However, what we want to do is we want to use our forged library to replace the original libsys.lib. However, this library is signed by us. There's a chicken and egg problem. If we override the original library with this one, no process will verify our signature. So to break the cycle dependence, what we did is we find a way to kill the AMFID and installD. We ask them run at the beginning, and they will load all the pre-waiting files and do the code signature for our library. Later, we kill them and force the system to load our libraries. And this is the way how we can kill the two services. Basically, we added some new scripts in the lockdown-d configuration file in which we use launch control to stop the two services. And finally, we will write back the root partition and reboot the system. After that, the device is in kind of jailbroken status. And after every time you reboot your phone, if you want to get the root, if you want to run the unsigned code, you need to run another app which will ask lockdown-d to kill the two important services. And this can be done by the USB connection or directly call the local host service. And next, Yangjing will show a quick demo for our work and conclude the talk.
Let me show the small video clip that shows that how our attack actually works. So we start with we start with the stage of the device is already rooted by the process that we described previously. So this is the iPhone 5s device, and this video is taken in the middle of the April. So the iOS 7.1.1 is the latest version available in that time. So we tested with the latest version, yeah, and still it works on the iOS 7.1.2. Yeah. And we try to install a unsigned application which is downloaded from the Cydia. So we downloaded an app called Air Hockey. Yeah. Since it's downloaded from Cydia, so it definitely has no signature at all. And we try to install the application. So for the normal device, regular stock device, it should be fail because it has no signature. But in this case, it has been succeeded. Yeah. So we can see that the Air Hockey is installed on the device, and we will try to execute it, and it works as normally. Yeah. So let's skip it a little bit, and we told that the jailbreak process, the rooting process, will not be persisted after the reboot. So we will show that how the app can be, So what will be happened after the reboot? Yeah. So after the reboot, we unlock the device and re-executing the Air Hockey app, but it fails to execute it because it has no signature. So, yeah. So on the log message, we can identify that execve has been failed because there's no code signature at all. But we can revive the rooting process by executing our own application at the first after the reboot. So after the second reboot, at this time, we execute our app first, which does that dropping of the file to let the libmis to be loaded and kills install-d and AMFID. At this time, both daemons are killed and rerouted with the injected library, so execution of the air hockey will be succeeded. Yeah. So at this time, the call sign is completely nullified by injecting our library called libmis.dilib. Yeah. Thank you. So from our attack process, an attacker can execute the code outside of the sandbox. So by the injected dilib, before the initiation of the sandbox of the AFCD, we can catch the point that we can execute the code outside of the sandbox, and the attacker can execute the unsigned code as shown on the video. And also, attacker has a privileged root process by hooking a root daemon, such as AMFID. So we can, throughout the attacks, we can achieve the escaping of the sandbox by passing of the call signing check and get root on the device. Our work is not without limitation. So since the attack does not include the kernel exploit, we cannot patch the kernel. So we cannot do followings. The first one is we cannot do execve of the unsigned application at the non-container location. However, we believe that it can be easily bypassed by replacing execve with a fork and dlopen to load the code from hooked processes. And secondly, since the sandbox of the container binary is enforced by kernel, we cannot disable it. However, also this can be escaped by helping of the other process. We can make a fork of the process of this that runs out of the sandbox. Then we can delegate all the functions. Yeah. And finally, our attack cannot debug the kernel because we do not have the kernel exploit. And to conclude the talk, we learned that the jailbreak usually requires multiple vulnerabilities to achieve the routing of the process. And Evasion 7 chained 9 steps of vulnerability to achieve jailbreak. And more importantly, as what Apple did on iOS 7.1 and up to iOS 7.1.2, while fixing some of the critical vulnerabilities, may block the attack by blocking some of the critical vulnerabilities, but not completely patching the publicly disclosed vulnerability still leaves the door open for the other attacks, as we shown throughout the talk. So, and we really thanks to the many of researchers that has done the great research work on the jailbreaking and iOS security, and these are the references that we referred during this work. And this is the end of the talk, and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to get any questions.